Thank you very much for having me here. So, the future is full of amazing things. On my way here, I spoke to a $150 device in my kitchen. And I said, "Is my flight on time?" And when it answered me, yes, I asked it to call me a car to take me to the airport. And a few minutes later, a car showed up. Now, somebody watching that interaction only a few years ago would have every reason to say, as we say in English, WTF, right? That, of course, is an expression that stands for, what's the future? Right? And, but at the same time, there are a lot of people who are reading the news, and they're saying WTF in a very different tone of voice. Right? Because they're scared. They read that Oxford University researchers tell us that 47% of all jobs are now susceptible to automation. Formerly thought safe white-collar jobs may go the way of blue-collar jobs of the past. They hear that self-driving cars and trucks will put millions of people more out of work. Right? They hear that we may need to replace the job with universal basic income because there will be nothing left for people to do. Now, I think this is actually a mark of our failure. You know, we have somehow come to the conclusion that the role of technology is to eliminate jobs. The role of technology is to make businesses more efficient, even if that means throwing people on the street. I don't think that's actually the right idea. And it's wrong for several reasons, just leaving aside the question of equity. It's wrong because, as Andy McAfee, the author of The Second Machine Age, said to me not long ago, the people will rise up before the robots do. Right? And we've actually seen this before. Back in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, you've probably all heard the term Luddite came because a man named Ned Ludd led a revolution where the weavers who were being put out of work came and smashed the machine looms. Right? Those weavers couldn't imagine the future. They couldn't imagine the bounty that those machines and the children of those machines would bring to their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They couldn't imagine that ordinary people like them, not just kings and queens, would be eating the fruits of summer in the depths of winter, that there would be so much choice of food and clothing. They couldn't imagine that we would put men on the moon, that we would build buildings in the desert a half-mile high. They couldn't imagine that we would dig a tunnel under the English Channel. They couldn't imagine all of the amazing things that those machines, under the direction of their descendants, would bring to life. And so when we think about digitalization, we have to ask ourselves, what are we failing to imagine? What is our failure of imagination that, just like those people in the early Industrial Revolution, could only imagine putting people out of work? They could only imagine replacing people with machines. They didn't spend enough time imagining what was possible with the aid of those machines. Now, eventually, they did figure it out. You know, in Victorian England, they realized, oh, actually, you know, we don't need to put all those children to work. Let's send them to school instead. Now, this was repeated in the 20th century with the high school movement, where we extended education to even greater levels. They cut working hours. They increased pay. And guess what? Society became more prosperous. They went down this same wrong path that said efficiency above all. And I think here in Germany, you've done a better job of creating a kind of stakeholder capitalism. But certainly in the US and in much of the rest of the world, the shareholder capitalism with the idea that it is inevitable that businesses want to reduce costs to the lowest level. It is inevitable that they want to put people out of work. It's inevitable that those jobs will not come back. And I will say to you that no, that is not what technology wants. Nick Hanauer, who's a friend of mine, was the first non-family investor in Amazon, a very wealthy guy. But he has this wonderful line. He says, technology is the solution to human problems. Right? We won't run out of work till we run out of problems. Now, I want to ask you, when you look around the world, are we done yet? Are we done yet tackling all of the problems of the world? Have we figured out that there's nothing left for technology to do? No power that we can exert? I don't think so. So when I look at the great problems of the world, I look at things like climate change. I look at rebuilding our infrastructure. I look at the demographic inversion with fewer and fewer young people in many developed countries supporting more and more older people. I look at income inequality. I look at displaced people. I mean, what we're seeing today in the refugee crisis is just the beginning. You know, if climate change is going to create more and more disruption, we're going to see vast migrations. And I think one of the big challenges of the 21st century is going to be, how do we actually turn our refugee crisis into an opportunity? How do we turn refugees into settlers? Let me give you an example from the United States, just the kind of stuck thinking. We have cities that have been hollowed out. In Detroit, where they're trying to actually get people to tear down old buildings, making bigger lots again because, hey, the population is a quarter of what it used to be. There are vast areas of the United States that are relatively depopulated, right? Why aren't we saying, hey, let's bring people in, let's build new cities? You know, I mean, when you go look at a place like Dubai, you know, a city built in the desert that was just a village on the edge of the sea. You know, we could do that again. We could do that for refugees. We could make them settlers. And I think that's a really interesting challenge for us to take up. Last year I wrote an essay called "To Survive, the Game of Business Needs to Update Its Rules." You know, we like to think that the laws of economics are like the laws of physics. They aren't. They're much more like the rules of a game. And periodically, we have to reassess the rules. We have to make sure that the game works for everyone. And so the challenge that I think sits before all of you is, how do we reset the rules of the global economy so that it works? Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of history of technology. We're so used to looking at graphs like this and patting ourselves on the back. This is from Max Roser, who runs something called Our World in Data out of Oxford University. You know, the graphs always go up and to the right, you know, and we're right to congratulate ourselves on them. You know, this is increase in life expectancy around the world. But I think there's a lot of people who aren't feeling that things are going up and to the right. That's what we see with Brexit, with the election of Donald Trump. So there's a different metaphor that I think we could use, and it's the metaphor from evolutionary biology of what's called a fitness landscape. Now, basically, the way in which genes contribute to the survival of an organism and the way in which populations adapt to an environment can be represented as a landscape of peaks and valleys. And so basically, organisms evolve towards these fitness peaks where they're adapted to the environment. And what happens is these fitness landscapes are dynamic. When conditions are stable, a population will stay just as it was. But when conditions are changing rapidly, populations migrate to another peak. Now, the thing that's really interesting in this notion of fitness landscapes is that it's very hard to get from the peak to another peak. You have to go down first. And that's why in the history of technology, it's very rare that the dominant company of one era becomes the dominant company of another. Because Microsoft's control over the personal computer made them choose certain things that made them ignore this new evolutionary peak that was happening with big data and AI. So that future was brought to us by people like Tim Berners-Lee, an Englishman working out of CERN, Linus Torvalds, a Finn, who weren't actually playing the same game as the Microsoft world was playing. And they invented a new world, a world of the internet, a world of open source software, which gradually evolved. And from that came this new fitness peak, which Google came to dominate, which was this world of big data and AI. So what can we learn from that? Here's a really interesting graph. This is a graph of US data only, but share of financial industry profits as a share of business profits. Peaked at close to over 40% in 2007, right? That really reminds me of what I saw from Microsoft in the years early in my career. Microsoft had so dominated the personal computer industry that there was no opportunity left for anyone else. Right? And as a result, people like Tim and Linus went somewhere else. They migrated to another fitness peak. They basically said, let's go make a new world. Right? And that new world turned out to be pretty good. But it was very hard for Microsoft to move to that new fitness peak because they were so busy protecting what they had. And I think we're in that same position. You know, our modern world has been built by finance. We have actually optimized our economy for finance in the same way that Microsoft optimized computing for tight control over the rules of software. And that has got to go. That has got to go. We have to stop thinking that what's good for financial interests is good for the world. We're in for a big reset, is my belief. So, you know, voters are moving away from the neoliberal consensus. You know, what will that new fitness peak look like? Well, one thing I know, even though things are changing, successful ecosystems always create opportunity for everyone. The reason why this new ecosystem of technology evolved was because it was the area where there was opportunity. That's why entrepreneurs moved away from the Microsoft ecosystem into the early days of the internet, even though there was apparently no money to be made. So we actually have to create the conditions for people to go find what's new and where the opportunity is, and not just protect incumbent interests. So many of the world's problems are coming because we are protecting incumbent interests rather than opening up the world for new possibilities. We will create the economy of the future when we remember that the function of technology is to empower people to do things that were previously impossible. Remember what I told you about the Luddite Revolution. So I want to now kind of talk a little bit about this process of digitalization. And the first observation I want to make is that government statistics and decision-making are too slow for the modern world. You know, there's this great line from Jeff Jonas, who's a high school dropout who went on to found a company that was acquired by IBM, became an IBM fellow. He was working in the security space. But he wrote this great line. He said, "Would you cross the street with information that was 5 seconds old?" So many of our government statistics are like crossing the street with information that is not just 5 seconds old, they're 5 days old, right? We are blind. And I contrast this with the speed with which modern technology, digital companies are operating. So take the fake news problem. There are a lot of people who said, oh, wow, we need to have fact checkers. Well, guess what? I'll tell you why human fact checkers can't solve this problem, right? There are 7 billion posts on Facebook every day. 7 billion, right? How many people do you think it will take to check all those posts? By the time you find the ones that are problematic, they've been shared 1 million times, right? You have to do it with algorithms, right? And the reason why I put this picture that I took from my hotel window this morning up there is because we build modern cities with cranes, and construction equipment, we don't build them with picks and shovels and hand tools. And in a similar way, we have to deal with the problems of the modern world, its speed and scale, with technology, with algorithms, with learning systems that operate at the speed of the systems in which we operate. Right? So that's why Facebook has to solve the fake news problem with algorithms, why we need to regulate finance with algorithms, why we need to understand how we're going to actually come to grips with the problems of the modern world using the tools of the modern world. So one of Mark Zuckerberg's rules that he expresses from the very early days of Facebook was move fast and break things. Now, that's probably something that people in the world of government and politics are quite horrified by. What do you mean, move fast and break things? I mean, that's kind of what people like Donald Trump is doing, right? But I'll leave that aside. What does Mark mean when he says move fast and break things? He means it's better, right, to move more quickly and respond more quickly than it is to be careful. So we saw this really in the US with the failure of our healthcare.gov system. Government spent years and years building a website. They spent better part of $1 billion. It didn't work. A small team of Silicon Valley people came in and built the replacement website over a period of 2.5 months with 7 people. Right? That's a problem. So the way that Silicon Valley works is expressed very well by a guy named Eric Ries in a series of books called The Lean Startup. He said, these are systems for learning. You build something, you build the smallest possible thing. He calls it the minimum viable product, which is defined not as something small, but as the smallest thing that will teach you what you need to do next. So a typical Silicon Valley project site starts small, grows big over time. It evolves. And basically, everybody who is working on it is learning constantly, and they're doing things to learn. They are actually running thousands of experiments every day and changing the features, changing slightly how it works to make it work better. That's so different from the way that governments think. We think we're going to go off in a commission, we're going to go off, write a bill, we're going to go off and design a program. We're going to get it right the first time because we have no mechanism for changing it. Not only that, we have no mechanism for measuring whether it even works. So often we don't actually build measurement in. In Silicon Valley, the first thing that everybody builds is the infrastructure for measurement so that you can say, we did this thing. Oh, it didn't work. Stop doing it. So there's a really interesting experience. Oh, by the way, I wanted to say this. One of the things you have to think about when you look at a company like Amazon or Facebook or Google, you see those thousands of programmers working there. Those programmers are managers. The work is being done by the programs, the algorithms. And those people that you see working there are the managers of the workforce of the future. Right? They are sitting there teaching their algorithms how to do the job. Now, in some sense, that's not that dissimilar from somebody running that big crane that I showed in the picture earlier. But it's really important to understand that they are focused on learning and teaching. Now, what's really interesting here is you can apply this to policy. My wife, Jennifer Polka, started something called the United States Digital Service when she was working at President Obama's Office of Science and Technology Policy. And the USDS worked with the White House on a new program for education. And there was a really interesting thing that happened. The staffers who were in charge of this program kind of called in the USDS staff and said, you didn't put in this feature we asked for. You know, we want our feature. And the USDS people said, well, actually, we did put it in. But then we went out and we tested the program with 1,000 high school students. And none of them used it. So we took it out. And Cecilia Munoz, who is the for a few more weeks, the director of the White House Domestic Policy Council, backed them up. She said, this isn't just how we should be developing technology. This is how we should be developing policy. Right? We should be seeing if the things that we are intending are actually happening. We need to learn how to do iterative development in policy in the same way we do iterative development in technology. That's what it means to be digital. It's not just having an app. Right? Tom Steinberg, who started a UK nonprofit called My Society, wrote once, good governance and good policy are now inextricably linked to the digital. One of the big challenges for governments is to learn to be digital. Now, the UK Government Digital Service wrote a set of design principles. I would advise all of you to go study this document. It really is a guidebook for how to do digital right. Unfortunately, with the change of government, the GDS is being de-emphasized and going back to business as usual, which I worry will happen in the US as well. But we really have to figure out how to get digital right. Josh Burson, who's an HR consultant now at Deloitte, likes to say, doing digital is not the same thing as being digital. Being digital is what you want to aspire to. Now, Jen Pahlka had this great line. She talks about how a lot of governments think that being digital is, well, we just have to put digital apps, as a front end to what we do. And she says, no, we have to go from apps to ops. And by ops, she means operations. We have to actually think, how does digital allow us to change what we do in a profound way? All right? And I think Estonia is a good example of a country that in the first wave of digitalization has done a pretty good job. They basically went and said, how would we actually create sort of an e-government system that stands alone, that doesn't just recreate the old paper-based processes. So often in the US, we look at these incredibly complex paper processes that could be made much simpler through digital. But I want to bring you here as I wind to a really important thing. When you think about digitalization, don't just look backwards, right? A lot of the technologies that governments think about as digital are the commonplaces now of 10, 15 years ago, right? It's not enough to think, oh, wow, we're going to have these digital information services, because the really key thing about the future is to understand that all of the principles that have been explored in the world of media, that have been explored in the world of information services over the last 20 years, are now coming to the real world. And I think Matt Kohler, who was employee number 5 at Facebook, is now a venture capitalist with Benchmark Partners, put it really well. He said, the smartphone is becoming a remote control for real life. And that's why I think it's really worth thinking a lot about Uber. I know here in Germany, you're not huge fans of Uber, but they teach us a lot about the future of the digital. First of all, there is that amazing user experience of being able to say, oh yeah, digital means we can actually just summon a car to wherever we are, right? We had connected taxi cabs before we had Uber. I mean, certainly, it's uneven, but many places in the US, you have a connected credit card reader, you have a little television in the back showing you ads. What the hell? Nobody figured out that you could actually use the digital to make a better experience where you don't actually can just step in the car, you step out at the other end, because guess what? Your smartphone knows where you got in, where you got out. You can charge automatically. With a stored credit card. This is a rethinking of the process, right? And that's why I've always loved this quote. It was a tweet, actually, originally from Aaron Levy, who's the founder of Box, another internet startup. He said, Uber's a lesson in building how the world should work instead of optimizing for how it does work now, right? So we have to rethink the way we do things. We have to use digital to rethink the world. Now, the last story I want to leave you with is a story of a startup, California startup, working in Rwanda called Zipline. because they're doing all of the things that I've talked about here today. First of all, they understand that the digital is bringing new possibilities to the physical world. One of the big problems in Rwanda is that it's a country with very bad roads, with a very limited hospital infrastructure, where many of the people are inaccessible. Turns out that postpartum hemorrhage is one of the leading causes of death, right? And they realized that using a combination of on-demand and drones, they could deliver the right units of blood to any part of the country within 15 minutes, right? So you can have on-demand blood delivery instead of the old system whereby we build hospitals, we build regional distribution centers. They said, wow, we can use the digital to rethink the future. And that, I think, is the real challenge of digitalization for all of you, because it solves two problems. First off, the complete rethinking of our infrastructure is going to help us deal with those problems I talked about earlier. It's going to help us deal with climate change. It's going to help us deal with putting people to work. It's going to help us deal with building the future that we want to live in. We have to take the possibilities of the digital and bring them to the challenge of reinventing everything and making a world that's better than the one we live in today. Thank you.